Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Vargas, and I'm your professor for forensic toxicology. Today, we're going to basically go over the course syllabus, and we'll get into some of the lecture content that I have for you guys. Let's go ahead and see if I can share with you the syllabus. And it's here. So pretty straightforward. You can see it on the Canvas website, but there are some differences compared to the course how I usually teach it, and that's when we're in person. So, but the student learning outcomes, they're going to be the same. Office hours will be via Zoom, this platform, and we can designate during each week, maybe having a time that works best for all, that I can be available for Zoom office hours, but certainly just go ahead and email me at the Cal State LA email, and I'll be able to respond to any of your questions. But sometimes it's nice to see ourselves in person, right, to talk about things. Historically, I've always asked my students in this course to buy the Principles of Forensic Toxicology, and the 4th edition is just fine. It's by a gentleman named Barry Levine, who is a prominent researcher and scientist in the field of forensic toxicology. And for those that are interested in going into forensic toxicology as a field, it's probably worth it to get this book. I've had a lot of colleagues that in order to get ready for certification examinations, that more and more labs are requiring the criminalists and scientists to be board certified in their specialty area. For forensic toxicology, it's a pretty good book, and making sure you understand all the concepts in this book really sets you up well to do pretty good on that exam. So something to consider. I guess I won't require you to buy it, so I've called it recommended texts. But I know not everyone's heart is in it. When not everyone wants to go into toxicology, for example. But you guys are criminalistics master's students, and so you're gonna apply for any position that becomes available. And I have really funny stories about former students that have taken my class, told me that this forensic toxicology is not for them, or controlled substance analysis is not for them, and they end up getting those positions in crime labs. And it's kind of funny. But they were set up. They had some good education from this class, and so we hope to do the same for you as well. Pretty straightforward. It'll be a midterm exam and a final exam, and I'm still debating on exactly how I'll proctor that this semester, being that we're fully online. Either take home or through Canvas. We'll have to do it. We'll do quizzes this semester as well in the course, and I'll have those quizzes, of course, online through Canvas. Quizzes are a little bit easier to do, I think, on Canvas. I usually have the courses, or the quizzes rather, timed, so just to keep that in mind. And then through Canvas, I'll often have assignments or reading that I'll want you to do, and you'll sort of stay tuned to Canvas this week to see what I post for that. And then finally, there is one kind of oral presentation that I have you guys do, certainly when the course is face-to-face, but since we'll be virtual, at least for now, just plan on creating like a narrated PowerPoint presentation, sort of like using this Canvas or PowerPoint. And I'll give you more details on, what my expectations are, but, you can read it here in the syllabus, basically finding a research article in the field of toxicology or controlled substances analysis, and then just go ahead and doing a presentation And so, you know, a 15-minute presentation might be like what, 10 slides or so, and just kind of go through a manuscript and tell me all about it and where it fits into your knowledge level, especially towards the end of the semester when I'll have this due, and some of the considerations that we all learn throughout the course, and if you're able to put those into your presentation. Okay. You know, and then basic stuff, late work policy, university policies are here, academic honesty. You know, the academic honesty piece, you know, I've really never had to worry about that for graduate students, but also have never really taught this class online. So I suppose there'll be some sort of temptation there to maybe work together on quizzes, or certainly assignments are fine. Homework is fine to work together, and I encourage that. But I do expect you guys to do your quizzes and your exams, you know, by yourself and without assistance from others. So, and then we get here to the schedule. So for this week, you know, I basically have had you guys, if you see there's a little, I'm asking you to basically sign up for Chrome Academy. We'll try to bring that in a couple times throughout the semester. So I just want to get you guys signed up for that so I can add you to my classroom on Chrome Academy. You know, so more details on that later. And then today I'm going to go into a lecture, History of Forensic Drug Chemistry, and this will be sort of the format. So this week we'll just have the one lecture, and I'll post some stuff for you guys to read and things to maybe perform as far as assignments. I'm not sure yet. But then certainly next week, you know, we'll have 2 lectures, and you know, I know that last semester in your first year of graduate school, some of the professors, when we got into COVID, were doing live presentations of the lecture content, and that's something I can definitely do. So don't worry, we can do that, especially if, you know, that's what you guys want. We can figure out that time, you know, like typically the graduate class meets twice a week at like 6 o'clock p.m. And so, you know, I can plan on trying to be available to do the lectures at that time, or mix it up with a format like this where I can record it, and you guys can send me any questions you have after you've reviewed it. It'll probably be a mixture of the two, but you know, whatever you guys want. So I'm here for you during these crazy times. So as you can see, we'll get into quite a lot of information this semester. It's a lot. You know, it's all controlled substances analysis and toxicology. Used to be 2 separate courses when we were in the quarter system. Now in the semester system, they're sort of combined. And that may be something I'd like to change in the future, but as of now, you'll get a lot of information in this class, useful information, and I hope I can present it to you in an understandable way that sticks with you, and hopefully we can get through the course together. But I will say it is a challenging course. So, all right. So that is the syllabus here. Let's get into the lecture for today. Let me start from the top here, and here we go. So let me move my bobblehead. I'm not sure where I should be, at the top there or not, but all right. So here we go, lecture 1. And again, just always feel free to email me any time of the day or night. I'm usually awake pretty late, so don't worry about bothering me. I really enjoy my interactions with the graduate students, of course. And some of you will be, I presume some of you I will take under my wing as the semester unfolds, and we will begin to do some sort of research project to finish out the semester. And so we have to figure out something. We might need to be creative in that regard, as far as, you know, what kind of research projects we'll be able to do. If we're still not allowed to be in the laboratories as the current situation is, but we'll figure it out. Okay, so if this is working, I should be sharing this screen. This is the first lecture, and I'll basically just be giving you a lecture on kind of some history. I bring in a personal touch with this as well, and then we'll just kind of do some basics of drugs and drugs of abuse, right? So, um, and we'll get into that once we move through the slides. I love showing this image of Richard Nixon. It'll be more apparent why that's an important signature there as we get through the slides, but this is Richard Nixon signing the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, a pretty pivotal turning point in our country's history of drug control, regulation, and law. And we'll get into that as well. So I thought it would be a fitting image for the start of these slides. So what is forensic analytical chemistry? Basically, you can attach the term forensic to any field. Yes, I'm moving my bobblehead. I'm not sure where I should be here. Maybe down here. Sorry, guys. Okay, so forensic analytical chemistry, I mean, you can add forensic to anything, right? So forensic just means we're applying that thing that we're saying after in the court of law, for legal purposes, right? So basically, the reason why I love this field is that it's basically born out of analytical chemistry that has a long history. And so while some forensic techniques that were not born out of, a research background and more comparison in nature, those ones have had a little bit of trouble in recent times as far as the sort of reproducibility or what the statistics are available for those techniques. And that's something we may talk about in some for future courses together. But that goes into sort of ethics and research ethics, and there have been some blunders that you've probably already gone over in your first year of the program. There's been some issues with fingerprinting and bite mark analysis, several areas of the forensic field where those comparisons and those sort of techniques were born out of pure comparison, and so not that they're completely invalid, just that had to change the way we talked about them in the court of law, right? Okay, but chemistry is different, right? I mean, chemistry has a long history, and analytical chemistry has a long history, and we're merely applying these principles to questions for the court, and so I really enjoy that and that aspect of the field. That we do have strong statistics. We do have really good techniques that can give us, without a doubt, right, the presence of one drug versus another drug in a white powder found at the crime scene or inside the blood in the system of a person that has passed away. And so how we'll go through this course this semester is basically the first half of the semester we'll be talking about the sort of solid dose drug identification. So that's the sort of controlled substances piece of the course. And we'll talk about analytical techniques and different ways to do this in the field. And then later in the semester, we'll sort of pivot and go into the forensic toxicology. And that is basically how are those drugs that we've tried to figure out how we could identify in a solid dose form. Once we've, in the forensic toxicology, like once we've identified those inside a body, what is the significance of that, right? So a question that I get often is, is this a drug level that could be impairing someone's ability to drive a motor vehicle, okay? DUID, driving under the influence of drugs. This is a big thing. We are seeing people maybe drinking and driving less, right? And we don't necessarily need to even worry about that in some senses, just because there's Uber and there's Lyft and there's other ways for people to get around. But that doesn't mean that people aren't taking other drugs and still getting behind the wheel and driving. And sometimes those drugs are prescription drugs, and sometimes those drugs are not prescription drugs. And And so this presents a challenge for even policing. They pull somebody over that looks like they're swerving lanes. They blow into a breathalyzer and they blow zeros. Right? There's no alcohol on board. And so, well, then what is impairing this person's ability to drive? So that's kind of the forensic toxicology piece, right? In a nutshell, is basically what are the toxic effects? What are the impairing effects of drugs inside an organism? So what we have to do for that, of course, is analyze samples from a living person or a deceased person. Get rid of the biological matrix that is present and try to extract the drugs that are in that system. And then once we have a concentration of those drugs, we're going to try to figure out what the relevance is of that drug concentration, right? Okay. So let me begin your course talking a little bit about the history of forensic toxicology. And I really geek out over this because there is a great history here. And I'm going to primarily be talking about here this idea of this thing called the Gettler boys. Okay, we'll talk about it. So the first forensic toxicologist as a profession was actually in New York City in the early 1900s, and then the name of the gentleman is Alexander Gettler, and he's here in the upper left corner of your screen here. So that's Alexander Gettler, and these are some of his other basically colleagues that worked with him at the time. There's a really great book that kind of chronicles loosely. I I think Deborah Bloom does a great job in this book, really hooking you in and bringing you in. Some of the details are not as great, but I think she does a great job overall. It's called The Poisoner's Handbook, and it sort of chronicles the life of this guy here, Alexander Gettler, and Charles Norris. Okay, so these are the two first forensic toxicologists and forensic medical pathologists in the United States. Pretty neat if you think about that. Prior to this, there was no rhyme or reason to. Basically, you had the uh, you know whoever was in charge of the police station, right? They're going to just determine whether or not somebody has died, figure out the cause and manner. But they were noticing that a lot of suspicious deaths during this era, and being able to detect the poisons inside them proves to be very useful. And Alexander Gettler here, he actually does a lot of really innovative and method development and method optimization, which still goes on today, right? There's a lot of analytical techniques that as a graduate student, you might go into a lab and say, hey, I want to try to make this method better, right? And so that method validation and method optimization stuff is a big part of our field. And so he did a lot of that and is credited with doing a lot of work and cranking out data that would support whether or not somebody was poisoned or died of other causes in a court of law. And so it's a really cool book if you have some extra time. One of the tests during the era is called the Marsh test. So it's just something to kind of the Marsh test had been around for almost 100 years or more before even Alexander Gettler's time. But the British chemist James Marsh developed this method for detecting the presence of arsenic in human tissue. So arsenic poisoning being a very common way to, a common way to sometimes poison somebody. And so this test uses zinc and sulfuric acid to basically create arsine gas. And when the gas is formed, you trap it in this funnel and it goes down this tube, it's heated again, and the gas decomposes onto basically on a piece of glass or whatever you have, And if it's present, it'll leave this gray metallic film known as the arsenic mirror. I tried to set up a mock version of this apparatus in the laboratory, so if we ever do get into the lab, I'll try to show it to you. Alexander Gettler, right, took this Marsh test and sort of optimized it to make it a little bit more high throughput, right? And used this successfully to determine the presence or not of arsenic in toxicology cases. So there is this idea in the field, and this is the logo for the Society of Forensic Toxicologists, also known as SOFT, S-O-F-T. This organization was first created in October 1970, and actually this year is the 50th anniversary of the organization, and we were going to have this really great meeting in October in San Diego. I'm on the planning committee. We had a lot of stuff going on. Of course, that all got canceled. So, of course, because due to the pandemic. But we will try to do something virtually, I think. And so one of the things that we wanted to try to do in this to get ready for this 50th anniversary is try to come basically talk about this idea of a family tree of forensic toxicology. So when you think about Alexander Gettler as being the first toxicologist in the United States, people like to think about that in a way like, how am I related to the sort of grandfather, the granddaddy of forensic toxicologists, Alexander Gettler? And so a lot of fields actually do this. You can actually go and Google like scientific trees, academic scientific trees, and you can sort of map, I worked for this person. So you guys will have worked for Dr. Vargas if you're my graduate student. Dr. Vargas worked for this person, Dr. Vargas worked for, and then that person that trained Dr. Vargas was trained by this person, and you go see if you can get back to the very first forensic toxicologist. And so that's kind of a geeky thing that I've been working on, and this is basically where I'm at so far. Pretty hard to see, right? But basically you have here in this little bubble, we have Alexander Gettler here, being that first forensic toxicologist, and he had what are known as the Gettler boys. So these are like the gentlemen that most closely trained under him, and so who were trained by Alexander Gettler. The ways of forensic toxicology as it was known to the time. And you can see the expansive growth of that, right? So each one of these individuals, not all, but many of the individuals went on to train others. And those individuals, and some people were prolific as far as the numbers of people that they trained, right? So this individual here trained a whole bunch of people, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing is that this toxicology tree hasn't been updated for many, many years. And so one of the things I've been tasked with is like how, this thing actually should be way out here. And you can imagine there should probably be some really big growth of this tree. So it's something that I've been trying to work on for the Society of Forensic Toxicologists. So we'll see if I can get this thing done. All right. So let's get back. So the Gettler timeline. So basically, Alexander Gettler's became the first professionally employed toxicologist, and that was at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner at the City of New York, along with Dr. Charles Norris, that first medical examiner. In the 20s, Gettler takes a post as a professor of chemistry at the New York University. Gettler is, like I mentioned, has done a lot of great stuff in the field. He was the first scientist to use a spectrometer in a criminal investigation. Think about that. First person to use an analytical technique, tool, a spectrometer in a criminal investigation, right? To look for, prove that thallium had been poisoning some children in Brooklyn at the time. He published a lot about cyanide that's still referenced today. And Gettler retires at the age of 75 after likely evaluating or analyzing the tissues of well over 100,000 bodies, which is amazing. Where a lot of this work was performed was at the Bellevue Medical College Hospital that was, had opened in 1832 and is associated with the New York University, which is where Alexander Gettler had his academic post. These are some images from the actual sort of like catalog, right? You guys are Cal State LA students. You're familiar with our online catalog. Not as cool looking as this, right? So you flip through the book and see this is what the faculty look like. Sorry, I'm not dressed up as nice as this guy. But yeah, pretty cool images. You get to like this chemistry department, the chemistry majors. You can see your instructors there, John Mandel, and then Alexander O. Gettler. And um, so those Gettler boys, here's a list of them. And these are the, this is the large circles Gettler, and then these smaller circles are these gentlemen. Um, um, so Cortivo, Dubowski, you may stumble across some of these names, man, potentially, right? When you're actually looking at some of your research citations, when you're doing your presentation that you need to perform for the semester, and looking for journal articles and looking at the authors and what those what that manuscript that you find that you want to present, what those people have cited, because some of these people have had prolific careers, and so they have a huge body of work that people are still citing today. Okay, the person I want to talk about today, moving forward, and you might be able to see where I'm going here with my little arrows in this, but maybe not, I don't know, is a gentleman named Sidney Kay. Okay, and so if you look, I believe Sidney Kay is right here. And so Sidney Kay, that's right, I'll zoom in here. So Alexander Gettler to Dr. Sidney Kay. So Dr. Sidney Kay, PhD, 1912 to 2012. So passed away not that long ago in 2012. A really interesting man and career. Studied chemistry and toxicology at the New York University, of course, under Alexander Gettler. Right, so there's the connection. Right, that's why he is considered one of the Gettler boys. Just that he had worked under, has the academic association with Alexander Gettler. He goes on to get his PhD in toxicology at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, which, by the way, still to this day has a very nice pharmacology and toxicology department. And so as far as PhD schools go, I got mine at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, which has another long-standing and sort of, one with a lot of history as far as PhD programs in toxicology. But the Virginia School of Medicine, VCU, has a really good program too. So anyway, during the Second World War, he became a captain and a toxicology for the U.S. Army. He returned to the University of Virginia School of Medicine as an associate professor of legal medicine. Ends up marrying a medical student from Puerto Rico, and they actually relocate to the island. There, he gets appointed as chief of forensic toxicology and associate director of the Institute of Forensic Sciences in Puerto Rico. By all accounts, he was an extraordinary lecturer with lots of humor, so no one would fall asleep during his presentations. And I'll tell you that I actually love this because I try to be as humorous as possible. Although I'm finding it difficult to do that virtually. It's hard, I can try to crack myself up over here, but usually I sort of thrive at the one-on-one interactions with you guys, and try to make things humorous as possible, because this area isn't, it can be challenging as far as trying to focus, and especially we're going through all these drugs and the structures and what they do, and anyway, so really cool. Published a lot, and had a really great career. So then a gentleman that got trained under Sidney Kay was named Ray Morano. Ray Morano earned his degree with Sidney Kay in Virginia. Then worked as a toxicologist at the Medical Examiner's Office in Virginia, and then also worked at the Army Environmental Health Lab. then eventually, and where this actually ties into me, is that he moved to Phoenix in 1973 and actually helped establish the first medical examiner's toxicology lab in Phoenix, Arizona. And the first couple years of the history of the toxicology lab in Phoenix was in the basement of the Maricopa County Courthouse. This is an image of that courthouse. It's at 125 West Washington Street in Phoenix, Arizona. Um, just FYI, I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. So yeah, I'm just geeking out here, giving you some history, which I think is really fun. So here's just some letterhead from, here's some letterhead from that address. Now, they eventually decided to build a standalone medical examiner's office to sustain and serve Maricopa County, which is ends up becoming one of the largest counties in the country, and the Phoenix metropolitan area being one of the largest cities in the country as well. They built that in 1975, and it closed in 2002. This coincides with that 2002, why I circled that. This actually coincides with when I became an intern. So I graduated, so I'm dating myself, right? So I graduated undergrad college. In 2002, I became an intern at the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office. This building, single story, super small, tiny building with terrible air quality handling. And so our offices for interns were like right across from where I could see bodies being autopsied, straight shot, like, and so the smells were absolutely disgusting. I'll always remember my time being in this building. This building eventually got shut down and demolished. And during my time, even as an intern, we were moving into the newest building, which was just next door. A lot of hilarious stories from that. Stories that are, I probably shouldn't mention. If we were in person, I probably would talk about them more, but since this is being recorded, who knows where this recording will go. But I have a lot of stories about my time at the medical examiner's office. And so just to give you a little bit more about me, so I interned. That's a story that is very common in the field. I interned and then became eventually a forensic chemist at the medical examiner's office in Phoenix. And that new address, 120 South 6th Avenue. Some hilarious stuff, well, not hilarious, but interesting stuff from the field of toxicology is, that we have to do histology in that field because the forensic pathologist needs to look at tissue under the microscope to try to determine cause and manner of death. So I just threw that image in there. Don't worry about that. Okay. This is fun. Noteworthy cases from Ray Morano's time at the medical examiner's office in Phoenix. So I just want to briefly go through this case. So this is one of the cases. I actually called him not that long ago. This was just about little over, just late last year, actually. And the reason being is because I just wanted to connect. I wanted to know more about my sort of family line, if you will. So it was really interesting to talk to him and get his views on the current state of affairs in forensic toxicology and the things that he did as the chief toxicologist in Phoenix, Arizona for many years. This was one of the cases that always stood out to him, and he talked to me about it. And so this is this guy, David Earl Sloan, that I have a picture of his super sweet Mercedes that is the basis of this case. So this Mercedes is found off the side of the road in Phoenix, and and this was, in 1983. This case basically got a lot of publicity just because of, the woman, the decedent here, Darlene Decas, 21-year-old, Scottsdale, Arizona. If any of you are familiar with the Phoenix area, Scottsdale is a nice part of town, and so this is a bright young woman that they found on the side of the road, face down, near this vehicle that belonged to the gentleman we just talked about. So her body was found there, and the gentleman, the suspect, the owner of the car, claimed that two bearded men attacked him and Decus, and while the couple were parked in their car after they had left the club, and they were just kind of hanging out together, and then they were attacked. So that's the story from the gentleman. It didn't really hold up, didn't make a lot of sense. And so the gentleman, Sloan, was charged initially with first-degree murder. However, this is the story that Ray was telling me, which he thought was really fun. He really ticked off the prosecutors in this case because they were going after this guy with first-degree murder, thinking like, hey, he must have done something to her and really hurt her, and so they were going with first-degree murder. So really throwing the book as far as charges are concerned. However, the autopsy did not reveal an immediate cause of death, and so Ray was the toxicologist. He got some samples and found very large amounts of cocaine in her body. And so the charge then was reduced to manslaughter and sort of really ticked off the prosecutors. And this all goes to this idea that, you have to let the science guide you, right? I mean, you're the forensic toxicologist, you're the chemist. There might be this temptation to, hey, I'm going to try to be useful as I can for the prosecution, but you shouldn't think like that, right? I mean, you're just basically going to do your analysis, do the science, and here are my results. Sorry if you don't like them. And in this case, the prosecutors did not like them. They didn't like them so much that they actually, which I thought was pretty fascinating, they actually decided to send the samples to a different toxicology lab in a different state to get the samples tested again, just to confirm Ray's analysis. And of course, Ray's analysis was fine and confirmed. So large amounts of cocaine found in her body. So that leads to this kind of question of, why is this an important case? Well, the drug overdose of Decus basically could have been, and may well have been the first. It was the first in Arizona, and maybe the first in the country, of where someone was convicted of manslaughter for supplying someone with illegal drugs. So they were never able to prove that, hey, he forced drugs into her, but he provided the drugs, and she probably didn't know what she was doing with them, took too much of it, and had an overdose death. So they went after him then with the manslaughter charges. He was convicted of manslaughter for supplying someone with the illegal drugs. Kind of fascinating, right? The ruling was upheld as they appealed it. The ruling was upheld. And so just kind of an interesting case there. Many years later, of course, this gentleman, is likely out of prison by now. But one of the enduring cases that Ray at the medical examiner talked to me about. So here's just a Google Earth image of that intersection where the old medical examiner's office used to be, and now it's gone. It's just an empty lot there in downtown Phoenix. So who trained? Ray trained several people in his career. One of them was a gentleman named Charlie Spees. So Charlie was somebody that I know personally because I worked under him when I was at the medical examiner as an intern, then eventually as a chemist. Charlie got his master's degree from the University of Arizona, and he served as the chief toxicologist at the Maricopa County office for many years. And he actually wrote one of my letters of recommendation to graduate school, so I'll always be thankful for him doing that. And he was a staunch supporter of public transportation, rode the bus to and from work every single day of his career almost. I don't ever think he drove a car to work or from work. And he always had the craziest stories about riding on the bus. I don't know. So you can see here in this case report that was published, he did work with Ray Morano, and so there's a record here, of course, of him and Charlie working together on cases in this case report, for example. Here's some images of what that new and current, it is still the current medical examiner's office in Phoenix is. It's at 701 West Jefferson. And this is where I spent several years of my career working in the newer toxicology lab. So during that time, another person came on board, Diane Mertens Maxim, and there she is. So this was my immediate supervisor when I was an intern and chemist. Lots of fun stories, lots of good times working in the lab with her. And so from her, I guess you could go to me. So Diane trained me. She taught me how to do ELISAs. She taught me how to do gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. She showed me how to do headspace volatile analysis for blood alcohol. This is a picture from one of our quarterly books. You can actually see I had a lot more hair back then. This is another chemist, Amy. Um, Here I'm probably doing a liquid-liquid extraction on postmortem samples, and it's probably going to go to from those once I got them extracted to the GCMS for analysis, likely a confirmation analysis. So just a fun kind of story of where I was and what I've been doing in my career to get to this point that I'm talking to you through Zoom and giving you this lecture tonight. So saddest story though about Maricopa County Toxicology Lab, it actually just closed. So the toxicology lab in Maricopa County currently is no more as of March 2019. The decision to close the lab was one made by the new current medical examiner, chief medical examiner, who calls the shots at the medical examiner's office, of course. They decided that it was cheaper and more and faster for them to send all their toxicology to a private lab, big private lab in Pennsylvania that I'll talk about throughout the semester. I don't have any hard feelings for that lab. They do good work. It's called NMS. NMS, you'll hear about it a lot in the field. They often do lots of work for people. So it is a sad story because I don't have my lab anymore that I can go back to and say hi to those guys. And I just went through that history of the lab, which was fantastic, and I'm so happy to have been a part of it. But it is what it is, right? There's some big decisions that have to be made, unfortunately, and they decided that it wasn't sustainable for them to have that toxicology lab, and it's a lesson learned for anyone in the field. Turnaround times and making sure you're doing your work efficiently, it's important because your job might be on the line. Sad enough, right? It's sad to think of that, but it is true. So of course, so basically I set you off on a path that I do seem to have a direct line to all the way back to Alexander Gettler, which at the time of me compiling some of this information, I hadn't really thought of that and hadn't considered it, which is really cool. So I'm really happy to share that with you. So just before we get into some of the drug stuff, just a little bit about some of the research that I'm doing. This is research that I obviously can't do anymore. This is a controlled drinking study that I hope to do more of in the future, but right now, COVID, I can't really do it right now because of course this would require a in-person meeting. But I'll talk at length about alcohol analysis when we get to that chapter in that week. But big, huge bread and butter work of any toxicology lab is alcohol analysis. And so in this research, we're actually doing some cool eye tracking stuff, without getting into the nitty gritties of it. But we're looking at the eyes because the eyes do tell us a lot about the physiology of someone and potentially what drugs they have on board. So we're just trying to better track eye movement during alcohol. I have a couple animal models. We do work with a freshwater planarian. Any of you biology majors in the house, you guys might have worked with these animals in your undergraduate training, perhaps. They're the famous regenerators. You can chop their bodies up into multiple little chunks, and each chunk will grow into a full head and tail animal within about 7 to 8 days. So people study these a lot for their regeneration purposes. I research them just because I think it's an interesting animal model. And so I have several blocks of data here. This could actually be something fun since we don't have access to the laboratories, but I do have a lot of data that I would love to put it all together and maybe write a paper about the utility of using an animal model to teach pharmacology, right? So we could submit it to, there's like some journals that are specific to education. And I think it's a great way to learn about drug and dose response, for example. So something to kind of consider here. Okay. Oh, this is just some of the data. So we've looked at morphine, we've looked at fentanyl. We've exposed the worms to all sorts of different things, and there's cool behavior that the worms will um, display based on different drugs that are presented to them. And so, in a world where maybe the numbers don't make sense, especially when we talk about marijuana and how much marijuana levels are in somebody's body, we don't know if that really makes sense for any particular behavior. Um, what is maybe more important is the behavior itself. So something we'll get into later, just sort of projecting that we'll talk about this a lot. So anyway, it's nice to have a model that we can do drug dose response with. So, okay. So get through that. All right, let's get into this history of drug laws. These are things I do want you to sort of keep in mind. The history about my path, I just wanted to share that with you. I'm not going to test you on that. But, the history of drug laws in the United States, definitely something I want you to be thinking about, certainly for quiz purposes and maybe exam purposes as well. So let's talk about the history of drug laws in the United States. The timeline will start in the 1850s, where alcohol prohibition laws were aimed at basically making sure people weren't super, super drunk, stumbling all over the place. Here, well, and then 1875, in that time frame, we had the famous sort of San Francisco opium den ordinance. So the Chinese there were doing were distributing opium, and that this was a thing, but from all accounts that these ordinances weren't really aimed at stopping that drug trade, but more about controlling the Chinese immigrants themselves. I always like to talk about the 1897 Tea Importation Act. It was early consumer protection against poor quality tea. And so here's these pictures. This was on the books for almost 100 years. These are the tea experts demonstrating tea. They were tasting the tea that came over on the boats to make sure it was good for everyone to drink. It's fascinating. I mean, could you imagine having that job? Okay. Now let's talk about the 1906 Food and Drug Act. So the Food and Drug Act is important because up until this point, there really hadn't been there was like no proof of safety or efficacy, and that was the dogma of the time. But the Food and Drug Act, we say we need proper labeling. Okay, so if you're gonna put cocaine in something, you just got to make sure it says it right on the label. So this label would be something that would be working out okay for the Food and Drug Act. So you got cocaine toothache drops, okay? It's on the label, proper labeling. Does it actually help people with their toothaches? That's something different that we'll get into as the laws progress and change over time. So, for the 1906 Food and Drug Act, no proof of safety or efficacy, but just required proper labeling. In 1914, we had the Harrison Tax Act that increased the documentation and taxation of the movement of opium and coca leaf extracts. But again, keep in mind, still not banning them or saying that that's illegal to do so, just increased documentation and taxing it. They just wanted to make their money. They wanted more taxes. And in the 1920s, of course, we had the 18th Amendment, right? So alcohol prohibition, and we know how well that worked out. because then in 1933 we had the 21st Amendment overturning the 18th Amendment, um, and so during this time, while alcoholism rates did drop, we did see a huge boon in organized crime. And in 1937, we had the Marijuana Tax Act, again, restricting possession to individuals who pay the excise tax for authorized uses. So basically taxing marijuana and not saying that it's illegal, which is actually sort of what has gone on today to this point. We have legalization for recreational purposes of marijuana in many states in the country now. And we're not, it's more expensive to buy it because they tax the crap out of it. And so back in 1937, there was a lot of people that did not approve of marijuana, as there are today people that do not approve of the use of marijuana for recreational use, right? And so if you click on this link here, I'm not going to go to it tonight, but Reefer Madness is a hilarious video that talks about, it's basically an infomercial of, saying that marijuana is bad and we shouldn't have it out there for the public. And there's people that agree with that today, right? But you got to check out Reefer Madness. It's hilarious. All right. So history of drug laws in the United States. Moving on the timeline to 1938. Let's talk about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Okay. This was enacted because there were, death of over 100 children that were taking these antibiotics. And these antibiotics contain diethylene glycol. And the diethylene glycol, was toxic. And so it's similar to the component of antifreeze. And so this cannot be ingested. It was a component of the drug that they were taking. And so the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act sought to make sure that there are safety requirements required and toxicity testing. Okay, so that's pretty important. You want to make sure that the drug that you're making to serve some purpose won't kill you. Okay, pretty smart. Somebody had to make that a law. Okay, and in 1938 they did. In 1962 we have the Kiefer-Harris amendments to the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, and this was due to a morning sickness medication, thalidomide, that caused death in well over 2,000 children, and also created these very debilitating birth defects, as you can see in the image here. So it is teratogenic, right? So the amendment, the Kiefer-Harris amendments, basically say, you know what? If you're going to make a drug that says it does something for morning sickness, you need to prove that it does something to benefit morning sickness and that it beats the placebo. Okay, and so that's the kind of the basis of the human trials. And out of this, we actually did create in the 1960s the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to sort of be the folks that are in charge of these drug trials to make sure that drugs are coming to us safely. And so there's a lot of that talk going on. Actually, I heard on the news this week that the FDA is fast-tracking a serum that's derived from the blood of individuals that have had COVID-19 and then have successfully beat COVID-19. That they're fast-tracking this plasma as an adjuvant to maybe assist and help individuals that are suffering from the disease. So maybe it'll be useful. That'll be good. Okay, so history of drug laws continued 1965. And something to keep in mind is that at no point still in the 1960s have we really criminalized the drugs, right? We haven't done that yet, but we're coming to it. It's basically been mostly like, let's just tax you more. Let's make sure there's documentation. Let's do the taxation, and that's it. So in 1965, we did have the Drug Abuse Control Amendments. And this was geared towards the amphetamines and the barbiturates. And in 1970, that's when Richard Nixon came in, that first slide of this lecture, signed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, otherwise known as the Controlled Substances Act. Okay, and that made the federal government in charge of narcotics and other dangerous drugs, and moves the enforcement away from the Treasury Department, right, and taxation, and moves it into the hands of the Justice Department. Just so you guys know that alcohol and tobacco and firearms is something different, and so those are exempt from here. We actually have the ATF for that, and so you can tell how important alcohol and tobacco is in our country, that it has something completely different regulating those entities. But all other drugs are within the realm of the DEA. And so the 1970 Controlled Substances Act creates the DEA to enforce these laws. Okay, so now you know. Now you know why that was important, seeing Richard Nixon sign that document. For better or for worse, it sets the stage for the current state of affairs of drug laws in this country. All right, so from that, we had some other things. In the 1980s, we had drug analog acts that are trying to deal with designer drugs. So try to make drugs that are, hey, the structure is a little bit different, but the ability of the drug to elicit a behavior in someone is very similar, and the structure is only changed ever so slightly. These might be analogs of each other. Therefore, we can place them into the restrictions of the Controlled Substances Act, right? So there were some laws there in the 80s to deal with that. And the idea of designer drug just kind of means that like you take the cocaine molecule and you add some things to it. It's not the cocaine molecule anymore, and that might slide through the cracks of some laws or other. And so kind of important to kind of think about that one. In 1996, we had the Comprehensive Methamphetamine Control Act, which restricted the access to chemicals and equipment used in the manufacture of methamphetamine. And if you're thinking about that, you know, that TV show Breaking Bad, so that's sort of like the clandestine laboratories that popped up in the 90s that were, you know, cooking meth and creating methamphetamine. And people were using that. Basically, they were taking pills of Sudafed from the pharmacies, and there's some quick chemistry that you can do and actually create methamphetamine from those. And so in 1996, they sort of restricted that access to that. So now when you go to the grocery store or the pharmacy, you can't pick up boxes of Sudafed anymore. You have to go behind the counter and ask for it. And then if you are getting a lot of it, you have to sign for it. And so they want to control that access. And then in 2012, we moved through Colorado and Washington State become the first states to legalize marijuana for adults. And so we'll talk a lot about that once we get into marijuana. Let's talk just briefly about the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. It does set up the scheduled drug tiers. So Schedule 1, Schedule 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, let's describe these. So any drug that is listed as a Schedule 1 drug, that drug has the most restrictions. And the reason why they're on that list is because there are no known accepted medical uses for the drug, and the drug has a very high potential for abuse. And so drugs that are on that list currently are things like heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and those drugs are on this list. Interestingly, there, I haven't read, marijuana is on the Schedule 1 list. And so that's actually really interesting because we have all these states that have marijuana legal for recreational purposes. However, those are states doing what the states want to do. But on a federal level, marijuana is still very illegal. It's Schedule 1. And so if you've ever gone into a dispensary, it's cash only because no banks will work with marijuana dispensaries because banks are federally funded, right? The FDIC, you see that on your bank's website because they're federally insured. Well, no bank that's federally insured is going to work with a dispensary because they're dealing with a drug that's illegal on a federal level. And so it's a really interesting discussion and conversation to have. And there's also the idea like, well, hey, marijuana might have some medical purposes. So what's the deal with that? So there has been talk about trying to move marijuana down to like a Schedule 2. Schedule 2 is a substance that has a high potential for abuse, and it may lead to physical dependence, but it's not as the abuse potential is not as high as the drugs in Schedule 1. And importantly, Schedule 2 drugs can have some medical use, okay? So the interesting drugs you'll see in Schedule 2 are things like, you'll actually find methamphetamine there. I don't know if you noticed that. See right here, I should have circled it. Methamphetamine is Schedule 2. Cocaine is Schedule 2. So that's kind of interesting. It's like cocaine has a medical use. Methamphetamine has a medical use. Yeah, absolutely they do. And we'll talk about those later to save time on this video, which I think is probably getting a little long. But welcome to graduate school. We'll have lots of long lectures, either in person or this format. So, well, not in person, but you know what I mean. Zoom, live, or recorded like this. Anyway, so make sure you understand the schedules. For sure, the differences between like Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drug, and try to memorize some of the drugs that are in those schedules. It'll be good quiz fodder to do so. All right, let's quickly talk about some of the commonly abused drugs. I love images like this, kind of funny memes, right? So a drug of abuse. So basically any substance that is used because it has some sort of desirable effect is used for some other purpose than it is intended, right? So that is a drug of abuse. So anything can really be a drug of abuse. A prescription drug can be a drug of abuse if you're using that prescription drug in a way that's not as prescribed, right? So if you go to the doctor and they're like, here's some medication for you, take one of these per day, blah blah blah, but you're crushing it up and snorting it and doing like two pills like that, obviously you're abusing that drug. So that's the definition of a drug of abuse. But it can be anything. Here's some of the common illicit drugs of abuse, right? So the amphetamines, so methamphetamine, so street level methamphetamine often looks like a white powder. That's a theme, right? Sadly, we won't be able to give you your unknown white powder like we do every semester in this course because you're not allowed into the laboratories. And guess what? Neither am I. So it's kind of an interesting thing that's happening to us right now. But I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get to the lab later in the semester, but we shall see. Cannabis, so marijuana. Main psychoactive component is delta-9 THC, and we'll go into that in great detail coming up soon. So cocaine, cocaine HCl is the sort of white, off-white powder. It's the sort of more expensive version of the drug, whereas cocaine base is the sort of crack cocaine. It's more granular in texture. The process of changing cocaine HCl to cocaine base involves a lot of adding of adulterants or having that be stepped on is another term used. So you're adding things other than the drug to that white powder to bulk it up so you can sell more of it. So cocaine HCl powder and the cocaine base are actually legislated a lot differently too. And that's just because of the mode of delivery of these two drugs. You can't smoke cocaine HCl, right? But you can with cocaine base, and so that's crack cocaine, and you can smoke that. In doing so, you actually are making the drug be a lot more addicting. And so, pound for pound, you will get in more trouble with cocaine based on the DEA's regulations of it. Heroin is sort of back and it's in a big way in this country. It's set the stage for a lot of the opioid crisis that we currently have in this country. And that's because of the ability to get it and get it cheaply. A lot of people that may have become addicted to opiates through prescription drugs and prescription drug use. And sometimes it all starts out legitimate, right? You have some back pain, you get prescribed some pills for your back pain, right? But that can sometimes go down a path for some people where they end up becoming addicted, and to the point where they can't get the prescription pills anymore, but then they still need to get their fix. Then they'll move to heroin. And so this is this sad story that happens every day in America. Um, but again, just another one of it can come in a variety of forms. These little baggies, this little black thing here, it looks like what does that look like? It looks like a little raisin. That's what's known as black tar heroin, but it can also come in a powder as well. So LSD, MDMA, ecstasy, these are all compounds that are considered drugs of abuse. And then, we have the designer drugs, right? Synthetic cannabinoids, there's synthetic amines, so mephedrone, the bath salts, right? The synthetic cannabinoids were called spice for a while. States that have legalized marijuana for recreational use, we've seen a lot less synthetic cannabinoids. So states that don't have recreational marijuana or medical, you'll see a lot of synthetic cannabinoid uses, or not a lot, but more than you would normally in like a state like California. Just kind of something to keep in mind there. And then we have, all these hallucinogens and all sorts of other drugs, and new things are popping up every day. I get emails every day about the new drug found that no one's seen before. Is it a new synthetic cannabinoid? Is it a new synthetic amine? Did somebody tweak the structure of another compound? And now we have something completely new and novel that it's going to take time for laboratories to detect. It's going to take time for people to even maybe notice that it's popping up in blood work. So really interesting. So the designer drug problem, this is statistics from whitehouse.gov, past year use of illicit drugs by high school seniors. A whole lot of people have tried marijuana at that point in their academic career. But crazily, some of these people have used synthetic marijuana, which is just something you should never do. Hallucinogens, MDMA, cocaine, it's there. So the drugs are there, the drugs are accessible. Pretty interesting problem. So what about drug identification? So the important thing to think here is that, hey, I have this white powder from the crime scene. I need to know if it's a drug of abuse. That's going to be really important for court purposes, right? So the scheme is usually something like this. We need to have something that's going to be fast and quick and easy and give us an answer. Then we're going to need something that's going to be more expensive, take longer, but give us the definitive answer. So you'll always see this broken down to like a screening technique or a confirmation technique. So some of the screening techniques are also called presumptive, just because they can't give you the definitive yes or no answer, therefore they're presumptive in nature. And some of those are called color tests, spot tests. Well, we will have had a laboratory. We would have had a laboratory doing this. So I'm debating trying to get to campus, and then I'll just actually videotape myself doing these tests. And at least that way you can kind of see and work through how you would do it by watching me do it. I don't know. These are some of the ideas that we're trying to come up with to make this as interesting as possible. But, we'll lecture later on the microcrystalline tests and the usefulness of that test over the years. We'll talk about thin layer chromatography. That's something that's not used as much, but again, sort of like a screening technique. And even the ELISAs are a screening technique, even though we'll talk about antibody-antigen interactions as the basis of ELISA and other immunoassays when we get to that lecture. But it is considered a presumptive screen just because you can hit some false positives with that technique. And so it's something to keep in mind. And then our confirmatory tests would be like headspace gas chromatography or gas chromatography mass spectrometry. That's the definition of GCMS. And we'll have lectures on all that stuff this semester, you guys. I know you're so excited to learn about it. And we'll talk about infrared IR, so FTIR, infrared spectrometry, is a confirmatory technique as well. So this may be the last slide, I'm not sure. Something I just want you guys to kind of consider is that how do you go into court and say, yeah, this is cocaine, okay? we actually have to have something more to talk about. And so this is called the Scientific Working Group for the Analysis of Seized Drugs, or SWIG drug. And you've probably seen the SWIGs in other areas that you've been lectured on. So what we have here is category A, category B, oh boy, hey, come back. We have category A, category B, and category C tests. Something that you just need, and so SWIG drug has established these tests in order of the most discriminating, so like tests that give us a great answer, tests that give us not as good but pretty good answer, and then tests that are sort of presumptive in nature that will always need more testing. So category A, like I mentioned, we have infrared spectroscopy. So we have mass spectrometry, NMR, Raman spectroscopy, X-ray diffractometry. So these are like kind of gold standard. These will give you a definitive answer, what you're looking for. And then in category B, we have things like gas chromatography as by itself, microcrystalline tests for an example. And then category C, our least discriminating, would be those color tests that still a lot of labs actually use. So it's kind of interesting. So definitely something we'll talk to you about. And then like immunoassay. So the ELISA technique is considered a screen, because even if you hit a positive, you'll always want to take that to another test to make sure you have it there. So here you go, guys. This is what we've been waiting for this whole lecture. What is the SWIG drug identification criteria? So here are some minimum standards. You got to make sure that you use different testings from the different categories I just described. And you need to make sure that if one category A technique is used, okay, then at least, and remember, A is our best discrimination. So if you're able to use mass spectrometry, great. Then you just need at least one other technique from A, B, or C. So if I do, mass spectrometry, I just got to go do a color test as well. Both of those things say it's the drug that I think it is. Yay, I win. I'll be able to go to court with that. Now, if a category A technique cannot be used for some reason, say you're a smaller laboratory in a rural community, you don't have access to instrumentation. This happens. There's a John Oliver piece that you may have seen about medical examiner offices across the country, and for example, and then just like the forensic science in some of these labs are not up to par. Well, if you can't for whatever reason do a category A technique, then you need at least 3 other different techniques, and 2 of them have to be from the category B. So you got to go back to that list and say, I'm going to need 2 of these tests from category B, plus a 3rd test, presumably from C, that you couldn't, because you couldn't get anything from A, of course. So that's how we get past courtroom and descriptions of how we know, there's a drug that's, if we're talking about controlled substances, how do we know that this is a white powder that's cocaine versus something else? And then in postmortem toxicology or antemortem toxicology, we'll be able to, say, hey, here's the criteria that we have, and that's the drug that I'm thinking of. Okay. Hey, you guys, we did it. So I appreciate you so much for watching this. Please, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can go ahead and email me. We'll have more of these lectures, of course, throughout the weeks. And some of them, maybe all of them, will be live moving forward. It's really up to you guys. You just have to let me know what you think. All right. Well, thank you so much. Looking forward to interacting with you more throughout the semester, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you.